Hi, I'm Max Keiser. Welcome to the Keiser Report. You've heard about fiscal policy. What about a fecal policy? Stacy Herbert.
Max Keiser, you're looking at this first headline here, aren't you? Man jailed after trying to turn feces into gold. A man from Northern Ireland has been jailed after an experiment in which he attempted to turn his own feces into gold went wrong, and he started a fire in the block of flats in which he was living. In his ruling, Judge McFarland told Paul Moran, "Rather bizarrely, you were attempting to make gold from human feces and waste products. It was an interesting experiment to fulfill the alchemist's dream, but wasn't going to succeed."
This is truly an amazing turn of events, because if you look back into the recent history of the Wall Street scandals, this fecal matter element has come up a few times, but really looking at the other end of the telescope, or the alimentary canal, as it may be. Elaborate, because I know we talked about it briefly beforehand. Elaborate on this a little bit, Stacy Herbert.
Well, Max, think about it. What did Goldman Sachs do but turn mortgages into fecal matter, as they themselves said, and it emerged in congressional testimony? So had this man tried instead to turn gold into fecal matter, perhaps he would now be doing jail time.
Yeah, this is the whole problem of the global financial crisis, is that the majority of people are trying to turn junk into gold, whereas the big money on Wall Street and around the world is by turning mortgages and this other stuff that is already representative of physical assets. You could say it's gold to begin with. It's a mortgage representing a house. They turned that into fecal matter. You see, these guys got it all wrong. You see, if he wants to get a job at Goldman Sachs, he has to learn how to turn gold into fecal matter. That's how Jamie Dimon and Lloyd Blankfein make their money, not the other way around. Making fecal matter into gold, that's a losing proposition, especially since the price of gold is so heavily manipulated on the downside.
But even this judge was able to recognize that it was a fool's alchemist's dream, that it wasn't ever going to work. So why is it that our regulators, the so-called judges and referees of capitalism and banking, they can't see that it was obviously never going to work, despite their pleas of ignorance that the likes of Lloyd Blankfein and Jamie Dimon say, that they couldn't have possibly known that their alchemy would not have turned into an explosion. In this case, this man caused 3,000 pounds in damages to the apartment building.
As I said, the whole point of the global derivatives market, and you think about the derivatives market as a $600 trillion paper fecal ball that circles the globe in worthless paper, and that was derived from initially something of value, a mortgage or a population as a whole, the productive asset, labor, jobs, stuff that has tangible worth, has all been turned into trillions and hundreds and trillions of dollars of worthless derivative antimatter that is circling the globe, threatening the very existence of our lives right here.
Well, speaking of fecal alchemy, Max, Citi agrees to pay $285 million after defrauding investors in a $1 billion derivatives deal. Banking giant never admitted any wrongdoing.
Well, another major billion-dollar fraud. This is just in the past couple of weeks. I've been trying to keep score. I mean, we had Bank of New York admit to a multi-$100 billion pensions fraud where they stole 0.3 of a penny on every transaction going back 30 years. The Wachovia Wells Fargo deal, it's near a $400 billion money laundering scam. The Supreme Court just said the MERS, M-E-R-S, mortgage scam would be allowed to be okayed by the Wall Street banks. That puts another multi-$100 billion scam beyond the reach of the law. Now Citibank's got another billion-dollar scam. Trillions and trillions of scams every week.
Yes, but look at the man in Northern Ireland. He gets sentenced to prison time. Here, Citi gets to agree to pay $250 million, as if somehow they had the upper hand in the situation. Fraud, as William K. Black constantly tells us, is a crime. These people should be doing time.
Yeah, it's amazing, this legal convention, that they don't have to admit wrongdoing. They pay a fine, so obviously they did wrong, but they don't have to admit to doing wrong. Why is this? Because they're afraid that if they had to admit doing wrong, if Citigroup had to come out and say, we committed fraud, that the depositors, there would be a run on the bank, and this would cause systemic instability. Well, I think, isn't it the fact that by allowing a major corporation to pretend as if they haven't committed fraud, representing systemic risk to this system, isn't that something that maybe the Justice Department should figure out, that by perpetually allowing banks to steal money, and then they don't have to admit guilt, and they pay a 1 or 2% fine of the money they stole, that maybe this is contributing to systemic uncertainty, systemic potential liability?
Systemic injustice, and this causes revolution. And you saw that in Libya. And I want to turn to this image here, Max, from CERT following the murder of Gaddafi. Today, Libya. Tomorrow, Wall Street. And as you see, this is surrounded by some rebels that the American military-industrial complex and the people are cheering in their bread and circuses. But once they show up on Wall Street and they join the Occupy Wall Street, it'll probably be a different story.
Yeah, if Muammar Gaddafi had gotten on a jet and landed on Wall Street so at some point in the last 3 months, he would have been immediately put on the board of directors of JP Morgan. They would have given him a multi-billion-dollar bonus, and he would be doing fantastic. He would be on all the talk shows talking about his plan to monetize his country's assets in the greater good of a global oil kleptocratic dream state of never-ending gusher of profits for the top 1/10 of 1%. Now, the Occupy Wall Street movement and the global insurrection against banker occupation has to ask themselves why justice was selectively served against Gaddafi and not Tony Blair or Jamie Dimon or Lloyd Blankfein. How come those guys are not hiding in a spider hole somewhere and then pulled out, in a blood-soaked rag?
I actually have some more headlines on Libya coming up, but first I want to bring your alma mater, Payne Weber, into this story. Ex-Wall Street banker identified as key figure in Olympus scandal. No, it is not you, Max.
No.
But it is a former co-worker, Hajime Jim Sagawa. He's a Japanese-American. He worked at Payne Weber, where you started your career.
That's right.
He also worked at Drexel Burnham. And then he went to Nomura Bank. And then, after Nomura, he went to advise Japanese blue-chip firm Olympus Corporation. And lo and behold, he advised them on a $2 billion merger. And his fee, it turns out, was $687 million. This scandal has now caused Olympus shares to fall by half.
I think that's more than even Kate Moss makes. Well, yeah, that's a remarkable larcenistic move, again, by a banker. From my alma mater, Payne Weber. The Zuccotti Park Occupy Wall Street protest happened right in front of 140 Broadway. That's where I started my career on Wall Street in 1982, was right in that building. I think it was the 18th floor of that building where Payne Weber, at that time before they got taken over by UBS of Switzerland, another firm that's been caught engaged in massive fraud.
Well, the sum was equal to a third of the 2008 takeover deal to which it related, compared with the 1% to 2% bankers usually charge. So you see this acceleration of the fraud. Because they're allowed to get away with it on all of these other deals, on this Wachovia deal, on the Countrywide deal, on the Goldman Sachs deal. Repeatedly, they're allowed to get away with it. So it doesn't make any sense for them to go small time and only charge 1% or 2% for this.
Right. If there's not going to be any penalties, then what's the message being sent? Take more. Take more. There's no penalties. We're just opening the safe. Take all you want. We'll just impose austerity measures. And if we need to, we'll just throw in some more tear gas. Hey, Greek people, you don't like having your wealth stolen? Well, here's some more tear gas.
Well, this is forwarded to PricewaterhouseCoopers, who looked at the deal to see if there was any wrongdoing. They said, quote, based on the review we have undertaken to date, we were unable to confirm that there has been improper conduct. However, given the sums of money involved and some of the unusual decisions that have been made, it cannot be ruled out at this stage.
Aha! PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the big accounting firms. this is not talked about much. They talk about the corruption in the rating agencies. You talk about the corruption on Wall Street. You talk about the corruption in the money management business. But not a lot of people talk about the corruption in the accounting business. Remember, Arthur Andersen was Enron's accountant. They didn't survive. They were put out of business, and that business was sucked up by the remaining accountancies, of which Price Waterhouse is one of them.
Yeah, but we have these too big to fail in the rating agencies, in these accounting agencies, and the banks. And you also have it, Max, in the other key element of the global financial fraud going on, and that's the military-industrial complex. Fraudulent defense contractors paid $1 trillion. Hundreds of defense contractors that defrauded the U.S. military received more than $1.1 trillion in Pentagon contracts during the past decade, according to a Department of Defense report prepared for Senator Bernie Sanders. He said the ugly truth is that virtually all of the major defense contractors in this country for years have been engaged in systemic fraudulent behavior while receiving hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer money.
That's another big dimension of the outright banking scandal. Somebody pointed out it's not bread and circuses, it's just circuses without bread. You know, they're just doing the public assassinations on TV for people's titillation, like the porn associated with the Gaddafi murder is titillating for the people who are being asked to suffer austerity measures, because it takes their mind off the fact that they're starving to death for a few minutes. But other than that, there's no function to this.
And then this final headline for those two rebels there in that photo, today Libya, tomorrow Wall Street. Well, here's a headline for them, Max. British businessmen told, pack your bags for Libya.
Whoa.
Woo!
Yeah.
So this is from Defense Secretary Philip Hammond, and he told the BBC, now that the campaign is over, I would expect British companies to be, even today, packing their suitcases and looking to get out to Libya to take part in the reconstruction of that country as soon as they can.
Go Britannia. Well, I guess more money for Britain.
Exactly, but it's also the exact same con that the bankers did. They destroyed the infrastructure of the global banking system and then said, here, let us fix it. Let us loan money to the Fed. Let us loan money to the Treasury. And one final quote from this article, Max, is one MP, Daniel Kaczynski from the UK All-Party Group for Libya, said, in the past, freedom has been paid for with blood and gold. In these difficult economic times, it should not be too much to ask a country with Libya's wealth and resources to pay their share of gold.
Oh, yeah. Gold. More gold! All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
All right, don't go away. Much more coming your way, so stay right there. Hi, Max Keiser. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to go to New York and speak with best-selling author Stephen Lieb. His new book is called Red Alert: How China's Growing Prosperity Threatens the American Way of Life. Stephen Lieb, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here.
All right, great. Stephen Lieb, what is the American way of life that China's growing prosperity threatens? Break it down a little bit for us.
Well, I mean, it's already happening, Max. I mean, if you just look at the last, let's say, decade or so, what you'll see is that you've had a protracted, steady uptrend in commodity prices. I mean, there have been interruptions along the way. We've had a little bit of an interruption this year, but I think, you know, maybe one of the best ways of phrasing it is if you had gone back, let's say, in a time machine to 1999, 98, and told, let's say, the top 20 economists in the world that U.S. unemployment is going to climb to 9.1%, and that Europe is going to be on the brink of major recession with virtually no growth, what would you expect the price of oil and copper to be? Well, I think those economists would look at the prices of oil and copper in the 1990s, and they would say certainly at the low end of those ranges. And that would be maybe 60 cents or 50 cents or maybe even 30 cents for the price of copper, and maybe $15 or $10 for the price of oil. Today, in this world, we're sitting with oil at $110 in terms of how it's priced in Europe, and we're sitting with copper well over $3 a pound. I mean, these are prices that are possibly 10 times higher than we could have reasonably expected based on current economic conditions in Europe and in the United States. Therefore you have to conclude that, this rapacious appetite for commodities that China now has and will continue to have has really been a massive, massive headwind in terms of how Americans live. And it's not going to let up. If anything, it's going to get worse, because part of this appetite that China has for commodities comes from the fact that they see the writing on the wall, and they probably saw it 20 years ago, that you're not going to build a sustaining economy on hydrocarbons. It's just that simple. I don't know whether we're at peak oil or peak this or peak that, but sooner or later you're going to get to the point where you're not going to have enough oil or even enough coal to supply the needs of a world that's going to continue to grow. And China right now is preparing for those days. They're not trying to deliberately hurt us, but they're trying to basically prepare the infrastructure for the 21st century. And that infrastructure is going to include massive amounts of renewable energies, solar, wind, etc. China has an iron-like grip on wind because they control about 97% of rare earths. And rare earths are absolutely critical for making wind turbines. So when the U.S. finally wakes up and says, well, we also need renewables, guess what? Where are we going to get the resources for them? How are we going to enter this market? China probably has a massive position in silver, which is vital for solar. And it goes on, and copper. The United States is fighting a war in Afghanistan where we're spending billions of dollars. China is spending billions of dollars in Afghanistan, except they're mining for copper. It's really, it's sort of like this. We're at war with China right now, not a shooting war, but we're really at war for the critical resources that we're going to need to build the infrastructure for this next century. We don't know we're at war. China does know that we're at war, and they're doing everything they can to win it. Right now, China is spending in the neighborhood of $500 billion a year. $500 billion a year in new technologies and new industries, mostly devoted to new energies. That means that by 2015, China will have spent about $2.5 trillion, about as much as the United States spent in the Second World War, winning that war. And so China's on a wartime footing, if you will, if you measure wartime footings in terms of dollars you're spending on industries you need to win the war.
Let's take a look at the geopolitics for a second, because the U.S. is now sitting on top of a lot of the world's oil supply. They're sitting on top of Iraq's oil supply. They're now sitting on top of Libya's oil supply. They're all over Africa starting wars to secure that oil. So at what point is there a confrontation between the U.S., that's oil hungry, and China, and they're oil hungry? The U.S. has taken a very militarized approach to obtaining oil and sitting on oil. China needs that oil. Are we headed toward a conflict there, number one? And number two, is China's alternative energy approach, as you are talking about here with wind and solar, is that going to be able to leapfrog them beyond hydrocarbons? Stephen Lee.
Well, yeah, I think it already is. Solar right now, in many cases, is competitive with hydrocarbon, and so is wind. And China is the one that can produce the lowest cost wind and the lowest cost solar. So yeah, I think that they are leapfrogging to some extent. There's a lot of work to be done. That's why they're spending, trillions, literally trillions of dollars, developing smart grids, etc. As far as the oil that the U.S. may be sitting on right now, that's not conventional oil. That's non-conventional oil. And it really is not clear that we're going to be able to get significant, and by significant, I mean 20 or 30 million barrels a day from those, let's say, shale deposits. We'll be lucky to get 2 or 3 million barrels a day from those shale deposits. That's really the proverbial drop in the bucket as far as that's concerned. Conventional oil is kind of peaking right now. We're again, I come back to, instead of arguing about how much oil, this, that, there's a lot of different opinions about that. But what you can't argue with, Max, is the price of Brent. It's $110 a barrel. Despite all the oil we may or may not be sitting on, we're looking at Brent crude, $110 a barrel. You still pay nearly $100 to fill up your gas tank in the United States. Maybe it's $80. And that's how China's already starting to affect us. They've been accumulating the resources that have allowed the prices of these essentials to continue to go up. You know, I don't think this is really such an academic argument about, you know, oil this, oil that. I mean, $110 speaks for itself.
Okay, so you're talking about oil and the price signal of oil, and you know, you go on the price signal and you're drawing some conclusions from that, and you're setting up this scenario where China is basically eating up the global GDP and America is the big loser. Let's talk about another commodity and another price signal. The price signal for gold and silver. Are they telling us the true story, or is there a story that's not being told here?
Well, yeah, I think they're telling us the true story. I mean, you know, I think that, you know, you've had a correction in both gold and silver, but from a you know, a several-year perspective, I mean, these are, you know, been commodities that have made a lot of money for a lot of people. I mean, gold's been in, what, an 11-year bull market.
My question,
you know,
though,
I think
my question is really in terms of a lot of folks are speculating that the price of precious metals has been kept artificially cheap. Particularly on Wall Street, where there's an incentive to support the dollar versus precious metals. So going forward, the question, Stephen Lieb, is how do you see the dollar versus precious metals going forward?
I think, you know, I don't want to sound like a nut, because I don't believe I am a nut. I've spent most of my life not liking gold at all, but I think gold's going to go dramatically higher. And, you know, when people say favorite investments, I think you just have to own gold. Basically, you know, Max, it comes down to this. We live in a world of scarce commodities that are becoming scarcer. And in those kinds of conditions, you can't ration these commodities by using something that you can just print. Everybody can print their own currencies as much as they want. Gold is something that's relatively fixed. Yes, we add a little bit every year to the supply, but right now China and India, incidentally, are buying all the incremental supply of gold. All the new gold that's mined is being purchased by China and India. So gold is really just kind of fixed, and you need something that's fixed, and something it happens that gold has a long history as a monetary metal, and I think it's becoming a de facto currency just as we speak, and I think that trend is going to continue. And if you look at it from the perspective of inflation, I mean, eventually you're going to get inflation. And when that starts, I think you see, you know, another leg in this kind of bull market that we've had in gold. I mean, I hate to sound, I hope I don't sound crazy, but I think you can almost look at the bull market that we've had in gold and silver as kind of a warm-up for what we're going to have over the next 10, 15 years, because, you know, there's no way around it, in my opinion. You cannot use paper currency as a reserve currency when commodities are scarce. Now, if there's some sort of technological miracle, if someone comes up with a analog to cold fusion and energy becomes very, very cheap again, all bets are off, and I'll be the happiest man in the world. But as we stand and talk right now, that's not on the horizon, at least in my opinion. And as long as these commodities remain scarce, gold is going to be the only reasonable reserve currency in the world. And I think the Chinese see this, incidentally, and I think they're headed for a gold-backed yuan. I mean, you know, in China now, I mean, it's amazing.
Whoa, back it up there, buddy, Stephen Lieb. Well, you think you're talking about, you're saying that China could come forth with a gold-backed yuan. Now, this would be because a lot of people are making the speculation, and they're saying that whatever country does come up with the first gold-backed currency is going to win the global currency war. People who've read, for example, Jim Rickards' new book, Currency War. Now, you're suggesting that China could make that move. Talk a little bit about that. We've got 1 minute left.
Okay, they're not going to make it overnight. I think China thinks in terms of 10 and 20 years, and I think over the next 10 or 20 years, they want to really control the gold market to the greatest extent possible. That will lead to some form of a gold-backed yuan. Right now in China, Max, you can put a debit card and get $150,000 worth of gold out of a machine. I mean, they're on their way. They want their public to own as much gold as possible. They're probably going to be accumulating as much gold as possible. Now, whether that leads to literally a gold-backed yuan or some facsimile, I think it's going to happen. It's not going to happen tomorrow, probably not in the next 5 years. But again, China thinks in 10 and 20-year increments, and it will happen within the next 10 or 15 years, in my opinion.
All right, Stephen Lieb, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thanks, Max.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Stephen Lieb. He's the author of Red Alert, How China's Growing Prosperity Threatens the American Way of Life. You can tweet us at Keiser Report or visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/Keiser Report. You can send me an email at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.